In this film, we're going to talk about carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. These are the things which make up most of our food. They're needed for supplying us with energy and warmth, and also for life itself, though we do need some other substances as well in small amounts from our food. As you know, our bodies are made up of millions of tiny cells. Now, although these all have different jobs to do, they are basically very similar. All of them need to get their nourishment from the food which we eat. We begin the study of nutrition by examining a single-celled organism, since a great deal of what we can learn from this is applicable to the cells of the human body. A colleague who has one of these cells under his microscope.
The most appropriate organism for such a demonstration is the amoeba. Although its single cell is only 1/100th of an inch in diameter, it can be said to reproduce in miniature many of the functions of a complete living organism. In the center is a compact mass, the nucleus, which controls all its activities. I'm now going to introduce some food, which in this case consists of a number of even smaller living organisms. You will see that it has already managed to engulf one of these, convert food into energy or into the living protoplasm of its own body. Similar chemical processes take place in the cells of an animal such as man, but in these cases, food already chemically simplified is conveyed to us by the bloodstream. This nourishment is mostly in the form of sugars, fatty acids, and amino acids, according to the nature of the original food from which it was derived. So normal food can be roughly divided into three categories. The one on the left is rich in carbohydrates, which are converted by digestion into sugars. The center group is rich in fats, converted to fatty acids. And on the right, rich in proteins, which are converted to amino acids. Many foods contain a mixture, and milk in particular is rich in all three. With some carbohydrates, chemical breakdown begins as the food is chewed. In the act of swallowing, the food is grasped by the esophagus and carried by a wave of muscular movements to the stomach, where the breakdown of other types of food now starts. So digestion begins with the secretions of the salivary glands. Then it is carried on in the stomach, where a variety of digestive processes start. For example, the enzyme pepsin is secreted. This starts the breakdown of protein. After a time, the food passes through the far end of the stomach, called the pylorus, into the duodenum, where pancreatic juice and bile from the liver pour in, carrying digestion a stage further. Here we can see the positions of the pancreas, the liver, and the duodenum, which receives the secretions from both these. The duodenum is the link between the stomach and the small intestine. Mixed with the bile and the pancreatic juice, the partly digested food passes along the small intestine. Here it is submitted to the catalytic action of yet more enzymes which induce further chemical breakdown. A simple example of such a process is here formulated for sucrose, or common sugar. Its molecule breaks down to two smaller ones, both simpler members of the sugar family, fructose and glucose. During the whole process of digestion, hundreds of similar chemical simplifications are taking place all the time. Here, for example, is a fat found in milk. Its molecule breaks down into four smaller ones. Three are fatty acids, and the fourth glycerin, with which any fatty acid may recombine at a later stage. From a chemical point of view, the proteins are extremely complex. Now, the model we have here is not a protein, but indeed the protein molecule is very much more complicated than this, and even the smallest contains over 1,000 atoms. In this very simplified model of a protein molecule, each colored brick, and there are over 100 of them, represents an amino acid. All that happens is this. We are thus left with a great number of separate amino acids. But now let's go on to see what happens to all these broken down nutrients which have reached the small intestine. the enormously magnified wall of which is here shown diagrammatically. Millions of hair-like structures known as villi line its folds. Each contains a network of capillaries. Particles of chemically broken down and dissolved food pass into the villi and into the bloodstream in this way. This diagram gives, of course, a much simplified account of the process. So it is from the small intestine that broken down nutrients are finally transferred to the bloodstream and then distributed to every cell in the body, where they undergo hundreds of new chemical transformations. Let us consider the amino acids first. They are now recombining to form living proteins of increasing complexity. In this crude way, we can suggest the sort of thing that is going on. As each new protein builds up, by some mechanism still not understood, it begins to acquire the characteristics of life itself. But not all the amino acids get used in this way. Any excess of amino acids supplements the sugars and fatty acids, which are oxidized in the various cells of the body and transform chemical energy into muscular movement or heat. The amount of energy available in food can be found experimentally. A weighed, dried sample may be prepared for ignition in an atmosphere of oxygen in this so-called bomb calorimeter. The energy is calculated from the rise in temperature induced by oxidation. The sample is enclosed in a steel cylinder tightly sealed to withstand the high pressure of the oxygen. A thermocouple is attached to measure the rise in temperature, and oxygen is then introduced. When all is ready, the sample is ignited. The temperature immediately begins to rise. In this way, it is found that carbohydrates yield 4 calories per gram and fats 9. We can also make quantitative measurements of the rate of expenditure of calories by the body in different activities. This may be done indirectly in the case of man by measuring the amount of oxygen consumed in a given time, the subject wearing a respirometer. From a series of experiments like this, the total average consumption of calories throughout a complete day can be estimated. Let's see how it works out. During sleep, an average man consumes about 1 calorie per minute to pump the heart, to breathe, and so on. But when he wakes, Mr. Average Man begins to perform a variety of conscious muscular movements in addition, and his calorific consumption goes up. Let's see what he was doing an hour later. All this sort of thing was consuming about 4 calories per minute. Then there was that train to catch, putting it up to about 4.5. But directly he had settled down to office life, it had dropped again to just over 1. In contrast, his poor wife was then consuming 5 or 6 calories per minute in the house. That evening, Mr. and Mrs. Average Man played 2 sets of tennis, during which each was consuming, on the average, about 5 calories per minute. All this energy was supplied by the food they had eaten. This represents a typical daily intake for a person who leads a very active life or who does heavy work. Total, 3,500 calories. Those who do sedentary work require a little less all round. Fortunately, the amount we need tends to be automatically regulated for us by our appetites, and so the daily intake for an inactive person only amounts to about 2,500 calories, compared with the 3,500 for an active type. All this food, of course, contains not only the energy-giving fats and carbohydrates, but also proteins, which you will remember are broken down into various mineral elements and vitamins, which are